The 2015-16 Formula E title decider, held at Battersea Park in London for the second year in succession, and would also turn out to be the last time Formula E would race there, would go down as one of the most controversial moments in Formula E history. Going into the finale, Brazilians Lucas de Grassi driving for Audi Abt and Switzerland's Sebastien Buemi driving for Renault Edams were separated by 3 points heading into qualifying, with de Grassi leading the standings ahead of Buemi. However, what should have been a great title decider ended up being anticlimactic. But before we get into that race and why it was so anticlimactic, let's go through the previous races to see how we got to this point. After a successful first ever season of Formula E, which saw Nelson Piquet Jr. crowned the first ever Formula E champion, Season 2, branded the 2015-16 Formula E Championship, as back then it was a proper super season, unlike nowadays, was expected to be even better. For the second ever season of the championship, there was a big change, as teams were allowed to develop their own powertrains, which meant that there was a high chance of a performance difference between all of the teams. Out of the 10 teams scheduled to compete in Season 2, 7 of them would run their own powertrain. These being reigning Drivers' Champions Next TV, Virgin Racing via DS Automobiles, which is owned by Citroën, Venturi, who were also supplying powertrains to Dragon Racing that season, Edams via their partnership with Renault, now that Renault were no longer developing powertrains for every team like they were in Season 1, Trulli GP branding their powertrain as Motomatica, although they wouldn't take part in the season and would end up pulling out due to financial issues, Audi Abt with Schaeffler, and Mahindra, who liked with Next TV, developed their own powertrain. The only 2 teams on the grid that wouldn't run their own powertrain or be supplied by another team on the grid were Andretti and Aguri, who opted to use the powertrain that was used in Season 1, which, as you can imagine, put those 2 teams on the back foot. Andretti were intending to use their own powertrain for Season 2, but ended up going with the Season 1 powertrain due to mechanical issues during pre-season testing. Speaking of which, during pre-season testing, it was very clear that Renault Edams were the strong favourites to win the title, as given Renault developed the powertrains for Formula E in the first ever season, they had an advantage compared to the other teams who were developing their own. And given he was in the title fight the previous season, Buemi was the strong favourite to win the title going into Season 2. But would he achieve that? Well, let's find out. The first race of the season would take place once again, like in Season 1, at the Beijing Olympic Green Circuit in China. There was a slight change to the layout from Season 1, as the first bust-up chicane on the circuit was removed and was instead replaced by a straight that led down to Turn 3, whilst the chicane after Turn 3 was much tighter than the previous season. During qualifying, which saw the introduction of the one-lap Super Pole session, which saw the fastest 5 drivers advance into a one-lap shootout, the Renault Edams demonstrated the pace they were able to show in pre-season testing, as Sebastien Buemi took the first pole position of the season ahead of teammate Nicolas Prost by 0.2 of a second, with the highest non-Edams car, which was Nick Heidfeld in the Mahindra, being over a second adrift in third, showing the huge advantage Renault had compared to the other powertrains. And in the race, there was no stopping them, as whilst Nicolas Prost ended up getting jumped at the start by the man he took out dramatically the previous year, Nick Heidfeld, and ended up being forced to retire due to a damaged rear wing, Buemi had no such issues, as after he kept the lead at the start, he went off into the distance to take the first win of Season 2 by over 11 seconds ahead of Lucas de Grassi and another 4 seconds ahead of Nick Heidfeld, who had to fend off from the 2 dragons of Loic Duval and Jerome D'Ambrosio. The reigning champion, meanwhile, was in no man's land, as combined with his car being way off the pace compared to his Season 1 rivals, he had a difficult race, finishing 2 laps down in 15th, not even getting to the checkered flag. With his Next TV being way off the pace, he would have no chance of retaining the title, as come season's end, he would score a dismal 8 points, finishing down in 15th in the standings. At the next race at Putrajaya in Malaysia, Buemi would once again start on pole and once again look like he was going to go off into the distance. However, on lap 15, disaster, as Buemi would crawl to a halt at the exit of turn 12, dropping outside the top 10 by the time he got his car going again. This, as a result, saw him finish down in 12th, but would still get 2 bonus points for getting the fastest lap. Elsewhere, Grassi, after jumping Duval in the pit stops, would end up repassing Da Costa after he initially jumped him, and would later pass Buemi's teammate Nicolas Prost, who pitted earlier after Buemi crawled to a halt, hoping for a safety car, to take his first win of the season, giving him the lead in the standings ahead of Buemi. At Punta del Este in Uruguay, Buemi would bounce back from the disappointing of Puerto to become the first double winner of the season, winning by 3.5 seconds ahead of Grassi to retake the lead in the standings, and then would increase his lead further at the following race at Buenos Aires, finishing second ahead of Grassi and just missing out on the win to Sam Bird, who took his and Virgin Racing's first win of the season. The next race took place at Mexico City, specifically at the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, making it the first ever time Formula E would race on a purpose-built racetrack. The series would use a modified version of the oval layout, comprising of chicanes at the start of the lap, a bus-stop chicane after the first long right-hander, a modified version of the stadium section used in F1, and a bus-stop chicane in the middle of the famous Pelotada, which in later years would get removed. In qualifying, Buemi would end up in 5th thanks to a mistake during the Super Pole session, whilst rival Grassi started in front of him in 3rd. During the race, Buemi would end up getting frustrated with the dragon of Jerome D'Ambrosio, with Buemi making it clear of his feelings towards Jerome at the end of the race, whilst rival Grassi, after passing D'Ambrosio after the mandatory pit stop, would come through to take his second win of the season. Also, he thought, as he was later disqualified for his car being underweight, giving D'Ambrosio the victory and giving Buemi a 22-point lead in the standings. Little did we know at the time that the disqualification would have long-term implications for Grassi. Next up was Long Beach, and after being disqualified from Mexico City, Grassi would bounce back to take victory around the shortened layout of the streets of Long Beach, whilst for Buemi, the meeting for him was a total disaster, as he would finish the race 3 laps down in 16th after collecting the back of Robin Frins, breaking his front wing in the process and forcing him to do a car swap early on. This, as a result, despite Buemi getting the fastest lap points, saw Grassi take the lead in the standings by just 1 point. And Grassi would go on to win the following race as well, at the first ever Formula E race at Paris, to increase his lead further in the standings, whilst Buemi had to climb his way back through the order after qualifying down in 8th to finish on the podium by the end of the race. Then it was on to Berlin. No, not that Berlin. This Berlin, dubbed the Berlin Street Circuit, which was brought in as a one-off replacement for the Berlin Tempelhof due to the Tempelhof being used at the time as a refugee shelter. Berlin would be the penultimate location of the season as a result of the Moscow E-Prix being cancelled, and it was a weekend that Buemi needed to bounce back from if he was to swing the form in his favour. And that's exactly what would happen. After a battle with the Virgin Racing of Jean-Eric Vergne for the first half of the race until Vergne lost his front wing at the first chicane, Buemi came through to take his 3rd win of the season in a race that saw miscommunication between the Audi apps, which resulted in Abt not letting Grassi through for 2nd place. This, as a result, saw Grassi's lead being reduced to just 1 point ahead of Buemi as the championship went down to the final weekend in London for the only double header of the season. For the 2nd year in a row, the title decider would take place at Battersea Park, the same place where the Season 1 title battle concluded. And just like the previous season, it was a double header, which meant as a result of that, and with the point system the way it was back then, Grassi had to take pole in the first race if he wanted to have a slim shot at winning the title before race 2. But this wouldn't happen, as both Grassi and Buemi would end up having terrible qualifying sessions thanks to changeable conditions, which saw Grassi start down in 10th and Buemi down in 12th. Thankfully for race 1, the track dried up, and despite the nature of the circuit that made it quite difficult to overtake given how narrow the track was, both of them were able to carve their way back through the field, with Grassi finishing in 4th and his rival Buemi finishing right behind him in 5th, meaning going into the final race the gap was slightly increased to 3 points. Heading into qualifying for race 2, and the rain this time stayed away, unlike the race 1 qualifying, which meant that Buemi and Grassi were able to start higher up on the grid. And by higher up, I mean on the first 2 rows, as Buemi would take a crucial pole position, ensuring a winner takes it all race, given that both he and Grassi, who was starting 3rd, with Prost making it a front row lockout for Renault Edams, were tied on points, with Grassi being ahead on countback of 2nd places. It had been a very close championship, and with them being levelled on points, whoever finished ahead would become the 2nd ever Formula E champion. The race started and Grassi tried to jump Prost at the start, but the Frenchman covered perfectly, heading down to the first braking zone. Prost then covers the inside line at turn 3 to try and prevent Grassi from going through. However, as they approached the first braking zone, the championship would take an unexpected twist. In a matter of a few corners, Grassi and Buemi were both off in turn 1, with both contenders blaming each other for the accident. Both of them were forced into the garage, which would normally mean that the championship would be over and Grassi would be declared the champion and would not have it stripped off of him, as even though he would be punished, he was only given a 50-second time penalty, meaning it wouldn't affect the fastest lap points. However, because of the fact that back then there were car swaps, which meant each driver had 2 cars, and the fact that there were bonus points on offer for the fastest lap, regardless of whether you finished the race or not, it was still all to play for, and both teams along with Buemi and Grassi knew this. Given the other car didn't have enough energy to complete the full race distance, both of them were going out on track at certain points in the race, effectively treating the race as a qualifying session. Grassi went first, setting the fastest lap on lap 7 with a 1 minute 27.037. He was set to go even quicker on the following lap, however he is prevented from doing so as the safety car was brought out due to Sam Bird pulling off with a mechanical issue. On lap 12, Grassi would return to the pits just as Buemi was making his way out on track to try and beat Grassi's time. However, before he even had a chance to do a flying lap, the safety car was brought out again due to Robin Frins crashing out at the turns 11 and 12 chicane. Buemi came into the pits and waited for the safety car to come back in before he could go out and do his hot laps. At the end of lap 14, the safety car came in, and after the chasing pack had cleared, which was led by Buemi's teammate Nicolas Prost, Buemi rejoined back onto the racetrack. A lap later though, and Grassi would come back out onto the track and prevent Buemi from doing a fast lap, given that Buemi was too close behind the Brazilian on the racetrack. Clearly a tactical move from Audi Apps to try and ruin Buemi's party, and as a result, it forced Buemi to go back into the pits. A lap later, and Buemi would go back out on track, rejoining just behind his teammate Nico Prost, whilst Grassi came back into the pits. With Prost coming in for his car swap at the end of the lap, Buemi would have a clear track in front to give himself a chance of going for the fastest lap. Or, in theory it should have, as halfway around the lap, Buemi would come across the Aguri of Ma Qinghua, who also rejoined the race after issues early on, forcing Buemi to back off and create a gap for the following lap. Pushing as hard as he could, Buemi would once again catch up to the back of Ma Qinghua, who was lifting and coasting to try and save energy. However, this wouldn't matter, as when Buemi crossed the line, just as Lucas Grassi came out of the pits again, he took the fastest lap away from Grassi with a 1 minute 26.056, meaning as it would stand, Buemi would win the championship by 2 points. However, it wasn't over yet, as Grassi was back on the racetrack, with him locking up on lap 21, trying to take the fastest lap away, and nearly binning his car in the wall. However, on the following lap, Buemi, who stayed out on the racetrack to give himself clear air to go for another push lap, went even quicker than his previous fastest lap, this time having no hold-ups to do a 1 minute 24.582, going 2.5 seconds quicker than his previous fastest lap. Buemi would return to the pits at the end of the lap, putting the pressure on Grassi and Audi Apt. At the end of lap 23, Grassi would go even quicker than his previous fastest lap, but would be under 4 tenths slower than Buemi with a time of a 1 minute 24.934. Grassi would return to the pits at the end of lap 25, only to go back out again on lap 27 to give himself one more chance to take the fastest lap away from Buemi, with Buemi also going out afterwards in case he did. On lap 28, Grassi would lock up at turn 1, forcing him to back off and go again on the next lap. On that lap, Grassi would go purple in the first sector, and then purple again in the second sector. However, in the final sector, he would lock up heading into turn 11, and then make a further mistake at turn 14 to go 0.05 of a second slower than Buemi with a 1:24.633. Grassi would return to the pits, whilst Buemi would set another fastest lap on the penultimate lap to go 4 tenths quicker with a 1 minute 24.150. And with that lap set by Buemi, Grassi called it a day, meaning in the strangest way possible, Sebastien Buemi became the Season 2 Formula E champion. Despite so much frustration throughout the season, given how quick his car was, Buemi fought back to take the title away from Grassi by 2 points, which along with Nico Prost's win, assisted Renault Edams in retaining the team's title. Whilst Buemi and Renault Edams were celebrating, the fans on the other hand were left with a bitter taste in their mouths. Given how close the championship was between the pair, given that both of them were tied going into the final race, the fact the championship ended the way it did felt anticlimactic, and it felt like the championship, after an amazing season, didn't conclude in the way it should have done. There was so much debate after the race, with people claiming that Grassi caused the accident on purpose in a similar way that Michael Schumacher did in 1997 against Jacques Villeneuve, in the hopes that he would win the title on a countback, with others claiming that the two Renault Edams broke too early, leading to Grassi to career into the back of Buemi. Either way, even if Grassi did do it on purpose, it didn't work for him, as thanks to the rules on the fastest lap points, it allowed Buemi to snatch the title off him, despite being involved in the first lap crash. Who do you believe was at fault for the crash? Let me know in the comments below, and please keep it civil if you end up having a debate with someone. Grassi would end up getting his revenge in Season 3, as he would finally win his first Formula E title, as a result of Buemi missing the previous meeting due to WEC commitments with Toyota. Buemi and Grassi have not won another Formula E title since. For Season 3, the fastest lap points would change, with only 1 point going to the person who set the fastest lap, and would change again in Season 4, where the top 10 would only get the fastest lap point in order to avoid a similar scenario that happened in Season 2. Formula E would not race on Battersea Park ever again after Season 2 due to controversy with the Battersea Park Action Group, who didn't agree with how the public park was being utilised, and thus came to an agreement with Formula E not to host a race there again, and Formula E would not return to London until 2021, when the series raced in and around the ExCeL Centre, and still does to this day. The 2016 Formula E title decider, one of the most controversial title deciders not just in Formula E but also in motorsport history, and hopefully we don't see another like it ever again.